Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to a new video. In this video, once again, I'm going to be delving into the topic of qira'at. As we all know, the Quran has been preserved word for word, tashkil for tashkil.
It's very clear to you and to every single very advanced student and specialist that the standard narrative has holes.
No, it doesn't. Anyways, what I was saying is the Quran, alhamdulillah, has been preserved.
Traditional understandings of ahruf and qira'at cannot answer some of these pressing questions that are now being poked.
Pressing questions? What are you talking about exactly? What do you mean by pressing?
By and large, our ulama in the Eastern world are not aware, by and large, of what's going on in the Western side of things. And they're not answering those questions in a manner that it needs to be answered.
Okay, wait, so do you mean pressing questions that they are not aware of? Or pressing questions that they weren't really able to answer? It seems like you're slightly contradicting yourself. I'm not really sure.
And again, I encourage anybody who is really interested to go deep to take the class.
Okay, oh God. Listen, guys, if you're expecting some sort of thorough refutation against al-Qadi, that's not going to happen. I don't really respond to vague statements like the ones that he made. If he articulated some points, some arguments for his view, then sure, but he didn't do any of that. All he did was say some really vague stuff, and he just left a lot of people really confused. Of course, that did not prevent every Islamophobe on the planet and every critic of Islam to use those clips against the Quran, naturally. In any case, the good news is Colin actually made a video about the qira'at where he's using Orientalist material, stuff that you find in Western academia. Perhaps this is the stuff that's been bothering Yasir Qadhi, and perhaps I can shed some light on the misquotations, the misconstrued statements, and the sheer deception that we will find within this very video.
Biblical manuscripts have variants, and questions can be asked about their transmission through history. But these questions should not be discussed in public. It's not wise. They should only be discussed in private. I'm just kidding. Who do you think I am? Some Muslim scholar?
And I would never bring it up in public. And I don't think it is wise to bring it up in public.
Quickly and jump right into our topic with Gabriel Reynolds, who gives us a good summary. These qira'at, that is variant Quranic readings or recitations, are part of the history of the text, not its starting point. And the idea of a discrete number of different yet equally canonical qira'at did not develop before the 10th century, when great divisions over the Quranic text led Ibn Mujahid, among others, to sponsor this regulatory concept. Ibn Mujahid argued that there are 7 equally valid qira'at. Ibn Mujahid therefore marks a paradigm change, since before him, out of all of the works on qira'at, there doesn't seem to be any concern for limiting the readings of the Quran to a specific number. And while Ibn Mujahid does limit the number of readings, he does not appear to argue that the readings he canonized are of divine nature. Shadi Nasr says, Ibn Mujahid observes that the scholars' disagreement on the different qira'at is similar to their disagreement on the legal rulings. In other words, in the same way that some Muslim scholars differed on legal matters, which ultimately, of course, gave rise to different legal schools within Islam, they also disagreed on variant Qurans. No one argues that all the different legal rulings by the 4 legal schools are canonical and absolute, and that the differences among the various legal schools are of divine nature. In other words, no one claims that the Prophet himself declared and practiced all these different and often contradictory legal rulings. By the same token, no one should argue that the Prophet read the Quran in all the 7 and 10 readings, as later Muslim scholars vehemently argued. Unfortunately, Ibn Mujahid...
Okay, so let's hop to what Ibn Mujahid says. So Ibn Mujahid's statement in the beginning of his book is a very general one. It's referring to authentic and weak recitations. Again, not all recitations are authentic according to Ibn Mujahid. However, the reason for his canonization is to familiarize readers of the Quran with the recitations of Hijaz, Iraq, and the Sham. In other words, Ibn Mujahid is trying to familiarize the Muslim with the correct recitations. What he's not trying to do, he's not trying to tell you that the 7 recitations are similar to conflicting rulings. That would defeat the purpose of him compiling his book in the first place. Ibn Mujahid clearly points out that there are levels and ranks of reciters of the Quran. Some of them are imams, some of them should be followed, some of them are followed by their communities as a whole, and some of them are rejected completely. Again, the purpose of his book is to introduce you to the correct recitations. Furthermore, I'd like to point out that Colin's source is really trying to push this narrative that Ibn Mujahid didn't believe in the 7. He argues that when Ibn Mujahid uses the word اختلفوا, meaning they differed, before mentioning each recitation, this implies that Ibn Mujahid only saw one recitation as valid. He came to this conclusion because At-Tabari uses a similar method in his jurisprudential work. At-Tabari was Ibn Mujahid's teacher, hence Ibn Mujahid was influenced by his methodology. That's the claim. However, what does a work on jurisprudence have to do with Quranic recitations? As the author admits, these are unrelated matters, unrelated works, unrelated fields. The deceptive author, who is very familiar with Tabari's tafsir, should have returned to that book when making such an argument, because he would have found clear-cut examples of the word اختلفوا, meaning the reciters differed, followed by Tabari saying that these differed upon recitations are both correct. And this occurs many times throughout Tafsir al-Tabari. Secondly, ironically, this conflicts with what Colin was saying just a couple of minutes ago, which is that Ibn Mujahid believes in the validity of the 7 recitations.
Ibn Mujahid argued that there are 7 equally valid qira'at. Nevertheless, Ibn Mujahid chose his readers, 1 each from Mecca, Medina, Damascus, Basra, and 3 from Kufa, due to a complex situation there, for a total of 7. And in doing this, he did not argue that these readings were revelation. That is a fallacious assumption made by some later scholars.
Actually, if you go through Ibn Mujahid's book, you'll find that his introduction is all based around how the qira'ah, how the recitation is a sunnah. He specifically points out that these are recitations taken from these imams in recitation from their predecessors. Let's carry on.
Shortly after Ibn Mujahid, other compilations of various numbers of readings began emerging. Later on in the 14th century, the great qira'at scholar Ibn al-Jazari canonized 3 additional readings, but then changed his mind a couple of decades later, as one.
Huh? What? Colin doesn't know what he's talking about. That's just false. Absolutely false. Challenge to you, Colin. Produce evidence for this claim.
Subsequently, the scholars wanted to justify these variants by attributing them to different aspects of the Arabic tribal dialects. The variants are just different dialects. Yes, we've heard that before.
Colin, you don't even know what this quote is talking about. Okay, so Ibn Arabi specifically says, and some of them wanted to return to the origins and recite in every dialect. In other words, the reciter would repeat the same verse again and again in different dialects. And he would say, this is a dialect of this tribe, and that is a dialect of that tribe. That's all that Ibn Arabi is saying. So Colin, Ibn Arabi is not condemning the attribution of recitations to dialects. Rather, what Ibn Arabi is doing is he's condemning those that are reciting words over and over and over again in multiple recitations within like one recitation.
Throughout the centuries after Ibn Mujahid's canonization, debates continued over which readings should be used, how many there actually were, and
how many there actually were. This was a debate topic? How many recitations? Huh? This is again proof that Colin has no idea what he's talking about. This was never a topic of debate.
This means of transmission is multiply attested and thoroughly sound. Anything transmitted through tawatur constitutes certain knowledge for Muslims. This, as we have just heard, is how the Quran is believed to have been transmitted. However, several Muslim scholars have argued strongly that this is not correct. Al-Zarkashi says that some late scholars have claimed that the 7 readings are transmitted through tawatur only among the generations of readers and transmitters between the eponymous readers and their students. However, tawatur cannot be verified among the generations between the Prophet and the eponymous readers. The isnads of all the eponymous readers down to the Prophet are single chains of transmission, where the conditions of tawatur cannot be established with such isnads. His answer to this problem is a common one, simply appealing to the authority of the consensus.
Actually, that's not the claim that Zarkashi makes. Zarkashi believes in the tawatur of the qira'at. However, if we return to the Arabic, he says quite clearly here, وَقَدْ يُجَابْ عَنْ هَذَا عَلَى تَقْدِيرِ التَّسْلِيمِ, meaning for the sake of the argument. Not that he's conceding to there not being tawatur. Zarkashi clearly believes in tawatur. Early scholars from the first generations, first few centuries, did not say this. The recitations of the communities were seen as mutawatira.
And in fact, among the early Muslims, some variant readings were evaluated like hadith in terms of their authenticity. Ibn Mujahid believes some variant readings are wrong, others are awkward and cannot be properly justified. The variant readings of the Quran are each different in terms of strength, validity, proper justification, and their relative acceptance among the reciters.
Naturally, I agree with Colin here. What he's saying isn't really that strange if you think about it. Recitations were definitely judged. This occurred from day one when Umar bin Khattab dragged Hisham bin Hakim bin Hizam because he heard him reciting something that he never heard before. This is natural. Now, we're not only talking about words, we're talking about diacritical marks, pronunciations. Every little thing needed to be attributed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala correctly, perfectly. Unlike you guys who have put your blind faith in books with anonymous authors. Now, Ibn Mujahid's criticisms in regards to the 7 qira'at are mainly in regards to false attributions to the 7. He actually never criticizes Nafi', never criticizes Al-Kisa'i, never criticizes Abu Amr al-Basri, and never criticizes Asim. So this isn't really relevant to the average Muslim today that's reciting Qira'at Hafs and Asim. However, I'll give you this. Ibn Mujahid sometimes did criticize a few words in the recitations of the other 3 reciters. For example, out of the 77,000 words in the Quran, or something along those lines, Ibn Mujahid critiques Hamza in only one specific word. I hope you can tell the difference between the recitation of Hamza and the recitation of Asim. Here you go.
فما استطاعوا أن يظهروه وما استطاعوا له نقبا
فما استطاعوا أن يظهروه وما استطاعوا له نقبا.
Christopher Melchert compared Quran and Hadith transmission and makes some interesting observations. With respect to Ibn Mujahid specifically, he notes that Ibn Mujahid appears to have been careless about chains of transmission himself, omitting to mention links in his account of his own chosen 7. He describes how Al-Suyuti lays out rules for reckoning the quality of different isnads for the recitation of the Quran, and states at the end that no one else had done this before him. Here is a sign of how incomplete the assimilation of Quran transmission to Hadith transmission had remained until his time.
Christopher Melchert, whoever that guy is an absolute charlatan for saying that. Had Colin returned to chapter 21 in Suyuti's Al-Itqan, he would have realized that this is referring to Suyuti's classifications of Al-Ulu wal-Nuzul. This has absolutely no bearing on the authenticity or the weakness of the chains themselves. To suggest that criticisms of qira'at didn't exist before Suyuti came up with these classifications about isnad length is just plain deceptive. But I will give you the benefit of the doubt, Colin. I don't think that this is you coming to these conclusions. Again, if you return to Al-Itqan, you would have realized this. You wouldn't have brought this dumb point up. Because you know I'm watching.
In all of this, we see a difference between earlier Muslims and later Muslims. In the eyes of the early Muslims, a Quranic reading could be wrong or simply weak if it lacks the element of consensus, whereas later Muslims, especially the professional reciters and the legal experts, emphasize that every single individual reading that belongs to any of the 7 or 10 eponymous readings is unquestionably correct and divine.
Yes, early Muslims did reject recitations that were not agreed upon by consensus. However, the recitations that Ibn Mujahid listed out, I'm referring to the recitations of Basra, Kufa, Mecca, Medina, and Sham, they themselves fell under the consensus of those communities. Due to this, these 7 readings were seen as unquestionably correct.
It's important to note that the transmission of the Quran was not strictly oral, as Muslims very frequently claim. Melchert notes this in the article we just cited, and numerous other scholars have noted this as well. James Bellamy states that the variant readings he discusses in his article are important to us because they prove that there was no oral tradition stemming directly from the Prophet strong enough to overcome all the uncertainties inherent in the writing system.
This is a very interesting claim by Colin. What I'd like to show you is an example that absolutely refutes this. Check out these 2 letters in the beginning of Surah Yasin. These are pronounced Yasin. Now, without the diacritical marks, you'd have absolutely no way of knowing how to recite this. It could be recited as, naturally, Yasin. It could be recited as Ta'sin, Ba'sin, Nun Sin, and Tha'sin. Okay? Now, you don't even have to recite it like that. You could recite it as Tes, Bes, Nes, Thes, Tis, Nis, This, Bis, Yis. You could also recite it as Nus, Bus, Tus, Thus, Yus. And why are we just sticking with the Sin? How about we recite it as a Sheen? How about Ya Sheen, Ba Sheen, Ta Sheen, Nun Sheen, Tha Sheen? How about Nesh, Besh, Tesh, Thesh? There, like the number of examples that you could come up with are innumerable. And we're just referring to one word. We're referring to 2 letters. That's if you're going to view this as two letters. The scene looks like a nun. It could be that as well. So you could come up with an unlimited, or not really unlimited, but a really huge number of possibilities for these 2 letters, which can actually be 4 letters if you think about it. And yet, all the reciters have recited this as Yasin. Shout out to Mansour Ahmed from Speaker's Corner for coming up with this entertaining argument. Let's carry on. In a newer video that Colin put out in regards to the same topic of qira'at, he poses a question that inshallah will solve his queries about matters that have to do with interpreting the consonantal skeleton. He refers to Surah Al-Rum.
The compassionate. There are numerous questions and problems raised by these verses, but today I want to focus briefly on variant readings. These verses contain significant well-known variants, and we will call them variant reading 1 and 2 in accordance with Dr. Tommaso Tesei's designation. Variant reading 1, the Romans have been vanquished. They will vanquish. And variant reading 2 reverses the passive and active forms. The Romans have vanquished. They will be vanquished. To put it more concisely, reading 1 is Roman defeat followed by victory, and reading 2 is Roman victory followed by defeat. Clearly, these variant readings are opposed to each other, and they've been weighed differently by Muslim commentators throughout the centuries.
Very briefly, the 10 authentic mutawatir recitations all recite it in one way. They all say غُلِبَتِ الرُّومُ. Why? Why do they all say the same thing? Because the recitation is not taken from the consonantal skeleton, ya colon. It's taken through التلقي, it's taken through the sunnah. They learned this from one another. They took this from their teachers. There is not a single authentic recitation that says the Romans were victorious, even though both can be read using the consonantal skeleton. Hopefully you learned something here.
And of course, we must remember that Uthman restricted variant Qurans by destroying them and issuing his own written text. He did not send out trained reciters.
So what Colin is trying to argue here, it's a really fascinating point. So basically, the qurra, the reciters, who had memorized the Quran, who knew the Quran, upon receiving the masahif of Uthman, upon receiving the Qurans that Uthman sent, like magically forgot how to recite the Quran, and they were left with, these masahif, and they were like, okay, let's try to figure this out. And all it had were these consonantal skeletons, and they were just stuck trying to figure that stuff out. Luckily, they all read Yasin in the same way. But yeah, let's carry on. It's quite a fascinating theory, Colin. Let's carry on. I'd like to focus on this quote for a moment because this is just a wild one. Check it out. It says in the second line, they attributed the Quran variants to human origins either to the reader's ijtihad, independent reasoning, in interpreting the consonantal outline of the Quran, or simply to an error in transmission. All right, let's focus on this point in interpreting the consonantal outline of the Quran. You see, so again, this is the argument that the reciters received the masahif, and they would be like, okay, let's see, this looks like a ya, this looks like a ta, and they would simply try to figure out the Quran like that. So I found this in the conclusion of the transmission of the variants of the Quran. I had to look through it to the beginning of the chapter. When I found it in the beginning of the chapter, there was not much evidence brought for this. However, there was a footnote. When I looked into the footnote, I found out that this was an attribution to Ibn Atiyah. When I looked into what Ibn Atiyah said in his tafsir, it did not say this at all. What Ibn Atiyah is saying here is that the reciters of each of these communities used to pursue the different recitations, especially that which fit into the consonantal skeletons. Meaning that Ibn Atiyah isn't saying that they just picked up a mushaf and started to try to figure out what it's saying. Rather, he's saying that they listened to their teachers and they stuck with what fit into the rasm of the mushaf. Huge difference.
And in the Muslim world, this process can move very quickly. Ibn Mujahid picked a problematic reader in Kufa. His name was Hamza al-Zayat. His reading was able to move from the status of an innovation to that of divine revelation in less than 100 years.
Actually, the recitation of Hamza Zayat was the most popular recitation in Kufa before Ibn Mujahid was even born. This is affirmed by Al-Qasim bin Salam and Muhammad bin Haytham al-Kufi. In other words, it did not attain this status due to Ibn Mujahid. Now, I'm not going to accuse Colin of being deceptive here. I know that he's unfamiliar with the material, but basically Hamza's recitation was referred to as an innovation, not due to the variances in his recitation, but rather due to matters that had to do with tone and performance.
It is true that Ibn Mujahid codified the 7 readings by the beginning of the 10th century, but the notion of the 7 canonical readings took some time to be established as a canon. It's not until the 11th century that we see the notion of the 7 eponymous readings as an established canon. And
this is absolutely false. There are works written a few decades after Ibn Mujahid that revolved around the 7 canonical works, like the Tawjih al-Qira'at or Al-Hujjah للقراء السبعة by Abu Ali al-Farsi, and other works that had to do with Tawjih al-Qira'at. Within a century, the 7 recitations became canonical as far as Andalusia.
But even now, with the standardized Quran selected, again in 1924, things aren't so clear. There is no unanimity over the precise shape of the Hafs an Azm Qira'ah. 4 different lines of transmission are claimed for it, and discrepancies abound in the various texts claiming to transmit it. Now in this video,
Once again, I feel like Colin is simply unfamiliar with the material. The transmissions to Hafs that he's referring to here mainly have to do with matters that have to do with application and tone. This has nothing to do with differences of opinions being attributed to Hafs himself.
قل أذكرين حرم أم الأنثيين قل أذكرين حرم أم الأنثيين قل الله أذن لكم قل الله أذن لكم الآن وقد عصيت
In conclusion, guys, don't be fooled. Don't get intimidated by arguments that are brought forward by Orientalists against the Quran. Keep one thing in mind, as I've shown in this video, the so-called experts are not really all that familiar with the field, and at times, as I've shown, are quite deceptive. That's all the time I have today. Inshallah you folks found this video to be educational and perhaps entertaining. I'll see you guys in the next one. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.